Just going live. We're going live in 1 second.
Hi everyone. Welcome to yet another knowledge session in our series of knowledge sessions as part of the YLAC Social Action Incubator. As you know, the YLAC Social Action Incubator is an opportunity, a nationwide competition where students from 8th to 12th grades can form teams of 3 to 6 and submit their social impact ideas to address inequalities around them. We are in this year welcoming project ideas and proposals on 3 themes: gender equality, economic equality, and diversity and inclusion. If you've tuned in, you already know that we had knowledge sessions on both themes, gender equality and diversity inclusion, so far. And today we are meeting to discuss and delve deeper into the theme of economic equality. So once again, thank you for joining, and we are quite excited to begin this session. We have with us our facilitator, Sonakshi Agarwal, who is a researcher who works on the themes of labor and digital economy. Thank you so much, Sonakshi, for being here, and I'll just give it over to you now.
Thank you, Nidhi, and thanks everyone for joining in. Yeah, as she explained, I think we're just going to delve deeper into the very broad theme of economic equality and economic inequality, and hopefully we're going to be able to make sense of the most relevant parts of that. And of course, towards the end of when I am done with the briefing session, we'd be happy to take questions and comments from your end over chat as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, I hope this is visible to everyone.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, before getting into what economic inequality is, I think it makes sense to speak a little bit about what economics is in the first place, because obviously, it's a term that none of us can get away from, but it is also one half of what we're discussing today. Very simply, the branch of knowledge concerned with the production, consumption, and transfer of wealth is what we refer to as economics. And wealth, of course, money, currency, essentially the universal way in which we've come to understand uh, how we exchange goods and services today. And I'm sure many of you have already also studied in your respective classrooms that entire history of how we got from the barter system to then using currency, and currency as it looks like in its modern form, including all its electronic variants today, where essentially the idea was just to figure out the best way in which to exchange goods and services across the world. And somebody realized that having this common bit of paper to do that essentially is the best way. And here we are. Speaking about developing economic theory, now civilizations in Greece, China, India, the Middle East, Tunisia, which is in Africa, were theorizing on economics as far back as 1000 BC, 800 BC, and 500 BC. And that makes sense, right? Because these were some of the oldest civilizations of the world, which means that there was some kind of society that was set up. And as soon as you have that, you have the need to trade in order to, increase your standard of living. That urge has been there in human civilization since forever. And as soon as you have trade, you would have had thought leaders of that time thinking about how to make this trade more efficient. And so we've had economic theory and economic thought since that far away. And people like Plato and Aristotle, who are like known as philosophers in Greece, were also actually delving into economic theory, because as we will realize more in this session, a lot of these social disciplines and a discipline like economics are very deeply intermeshed. Uh, Adam Smith, which is again a name that many of you I'm sure have heard of, is credited with creating economics as a separate discipline, so to speak. Like modern economics is something that we associate Adam Smith with founding, and he was of Scottish origin. And 1776 is when he wrote and published his book called The Wealth of Nations. And among many other things that he spoke about, which have formed the foundation of how we understand economics and therefore economic inequality today, this key concept of the free hand of the market is something that became quite the tagline, right? And that is what this image that we have on the screen also depicts. The idea being that at least Adam Smith propagated this idea that we're not supposed to have too much interference of non-market players, and non-market players would be the government, one of the very main ones. So we're not supposed to have too much interference in how markets work and trade works and wealth creation works. The market itself has this invisible force that ultimately keeps bringing us to the equilibrium, ultimately keeps bringing us to this balance where everything will work the way it's supposed to. And that is how economics works, right? Of course, after Smith's work, there have been various economists who either critiqued this theory and others that he wrote about or added to it in some way. John Maynard Keynes is one economist that I assume that a lot of you may have heard of. I mean, Keynes actually spoke about somewhat the opposite, which is that we do need to look at government policy, we do need to look at laws and regulation of the market to a certain extent, because that can impact the market, and somewhere or the other, it is also important for that interference in the market. Other more modern economists like Amartya Sen has spoken about economics from this very important social lens of inequality, has talked a lot about its intersection with caste and class and gender, and why it's important to look at all of those things together. Jayati Ghosh actually is another very important modern economist who has spoken about these issues. This is, of course, if any of you want to go back and read more. So after this history, we go on to what is economic inequality, right? So very simply, when one person has more money and resources than the other person, there is economic inequality. And I mean, in some way, this image that we have on screen kind of encapsulates that, because we understand visually and also, of course, from what we know of the world, that money brings with it the capacity to do a lot, the capacity to buy things and have a lot, gather resources. It brings with it a lot of power. And we understand that this power is not equally distributed across the world. We see it all around us, right? We see it every day as soon as we get out of our houses. We see it in the houses that we live in. Everybody is not living in the same kind of house. Everyone's house is not the same amount of safe. When there is a flood, when there is too much rain, or when there is a drought, there are only certain people who get affected by it. A lot of us are absolutely safe because we're able to afford that kind of housing that keeps us safe. During the pandemic, a lot of us in a big way were introduced to what economic inequality can look like and what kind of implications it has, because for some people, the concerns when, for example, we had the lockdown were limited to, okay, what store is open so that I can buy 1 month's worth of rice and dal, right? But for a lot of other people, the concern was that, okay, I can't get out of the house, which means I can't work, which means I can't get wages for that particular day, which means that there is no way that I can stock up on 1 month's worth of rice and dal. And that is one of the simplest ways in which we understand this economic inequality. So yeah, which means that this economic inequality doesn't exist on its own. It has very real implications, such as an unequal distribution of very vital goods and services, right? Food, shelter, healthcare, education, transport. These are some things that we understand to be basic needs. And this is from where we start the conversation of economic inequality, where we understand that, okay, it is more like, I mean, fair, we can have one conversation about whether everybody is able to afford the same kind or the same model of iPhone or the same kind of branded shoes, which also is a conversation worth having. but it starts here. It starts at the point of whether everybody is being able to fill their stomachs, if everybody is being able to fill their children's stomachs, if everybody is being able to protect themselves from natural calamities, if we are able to go to the doctor. For a lot of us, that decision itself is such a big one to take, because we know that it is going to have implications on us separating with whatever savings we have. And for some people that's a large part of their total income, for some people it's more affordable. And therefore we think about these things, because as humans and as civilization that has developed a certain code of ethics, certain principles by which we've all decided to live by, we do understand that people don't deserve to die, or people don't deserve to not have care just because they have a certain amount of wealth. And that's why a lot of people are thinking about economic inequality. That's why we want you all to think about economic inequality, right? Education, of course, we understand how important that is. We also understand how expensive it can be. We also understand that less expensive education is sometimes not as good education. Public transport is inexpensive or expensive depending on which country, which city you're in. It's also vital because it gets you to your job, it gets you to your school, all of these important things, right? But all of them cost money. Uh, Now, the third important thing to understand is that there are cyclical effects of economic inequality, by which I mean that the problem of people having different amounts of wealth or different amounts of income is not restricted to just, for example, me having a certain amount of income vis-a-vis my peer in class. It comes from the fact that my parents probably had lesser money than my peers' parents 20 years ago. And the way that we see these patterns, it will in all probability lead to the fact that my children tomorrow are going to have lesser money than my peers' children tomorrow. And therefore this impact of economic inequality continues generation to generation, right? And as we know, it actually only deepens. It doesn't even remain the same, because I mean, we have data now that shows us that, for example, back in the 18th and 19th century, the difference between the richest countries of the world and the poorest countries of the world, which were Netherlands and Britain and India, by the way, at that time, India and China, was about 3:1, which means that the richest country in the world at that time was only 3 times as wealthy as the poorest. But today, in 2023, that difference is 100:1, which means that the richest countries in the world today have 100 times more wealth than some of the poorest countries, which is a cause of concern, which means that we're not actually making progress when it comes to the improvement of economic status of everybody in the world, right? And those gaps lead to a lot of other things which we will discuss. Right. So yeah, the concept of generational wealth, which I know has become a little bit more commonly understood over the last few years, that's where it comes from. That a, a lot of us have more generational wealth than many others, which means that we, like all of us, essentially are products of our upbringing, are products of the kind of home that we've grown up in, are products of the kind of jobs and access to wealth that our own parents, our own grandparents, and their grandparents had. And for better or for worse, all of these things have an impact on what kind of access to income and wealth we have today, and the kind of wealth and income that our future generations will have access to tomorrow. And so any intervention or any change that we think of when it comes to reducing this economic inequality has to emerge from that understanding, has to emerge from the understanding of that concept, that these inequalities run deep. Right. So, talking about then further about some factors that affect economic inequality, right? Because there's a lot of things, and economic inequality is also talked about or measured on various scales. Because, like, for example, the example that I gave right now was uh, a measurement on a global scale where I compared two countries or two clusters of countries. But then economic inequality is also spoken of at the country level, where we may compare two geographical regions in a particular country, or two types of communities in a country, or two generations in a country, where we will say that, okay, in the past decade, this has happened to the income levels. And then, of course, there's also some, there's an individualistic or more local level way of looking at this inequality as well. So speaking about the first one, and this is a lot of big words on screen, but I mean, we will realize that uh, they're all interconnected and they make sense and they help us understand this concept. So global factors, which I also think of as global historical factors, right? So racism, colonialism, sexism, war, the various wars we've had, the kind of technological progress that different parts of the world has been able to achieve or has had access to over the years, and also, of course, the natural reserves that the various countries have, which is like a very intrinsic part of just their own geography and their own climate. So, I mean, getting a little bit into all of them, I mean, when we speak of racism, for example, if we speak about it from a very economic lens, the manifestation of racism was the global slave trade, right? And we understand the slave trade as literally like this trade of human beings, where at some point, the powerful countries of that time and the powerful governments of that time decided that certain countries and certain races in those countries do not deserve the same amount of human rights. And we have the power to buy these people like cattle and use them for our own economic prosperity, because then these slaves that we buy become cheap free labor for doing all of the agriculture, all of the factory labor, a lot of other allied tasks that lead to the economic progress of our own nations. So, I mean, just to very quickly give you some data now, some of the countries that indulged in this trade at the time when the slave trade was at its peak were Portugal, Netherlands, Britain, North America, right? Many countries of Western Europe. And some of the countries that became victims of this trade were many countries from North Africa, India, Saudi Arabia, North Korea, Turkey. And essentially, I mean, this was very economic in some sense, but it emerged from a very problematic social understanding of how the world works and how various races interact with each other. I mean, there were very deep and extensive theorizations done about how certain races deserve to be more powerful than others, about how certain races have more intellectual aptitude than others, and therefore them having this kind of power over other races, them treating those other races poorly, those other races not having human rights is justified. Because these things don't happen in a vacuum, right? People who are trying to create these power structures have always gone about it in a very smart way, where they will give you 10, 15, 20 justifications, which they can then propagate, create that entire narrative. And that's how such unequal systems or such problematic systems sustain themselves over several decades or several centuries, as we saw with the slave trade and with racism. And of course, as we know, slavery still exists. We understand it as modern slavery. There are various countries of the world still where there is a slave trade going on, because of course in no world can we claim that racism has gone away, right? In no world can we claim that colorism has gone away. But it has very important economic implications, because then these countries that became victims of the slave trade did have a huge wealth drain. They had a huge drain of their human resources. And so they took that much more time to be able to build economic systems of their own. On the other hand, these same human resources that were traded as slaves from certain countries became a kind of subsidy for these countries in America and in Europe that use this free labor to bring up their economic systems, right? So they were able to get that done for very little, and at the same time they took away that resource and took away that power from other countries. So this becomes one example of how social factors lead to economic inequality, but we still see impact of that. Colonialism again became another such example. I mean, we know that certain countries of the world really went out and colonized a lot of countries in Asia, India being one of them, in Africa, in the Caribbeans, and so on. And there was a very huge wealth drain there. In fact, the Industrial Revolution coincided with, the peak period of colonialism, and there's many theories now that talk about how the Industrial Revolution was almost funded by this colonialism, because countries were able to use the natural reserves of their colonies. They were able to set up factories in those colonies and get cheap labor to work in those mills, in those factories, and then sell all of those products by exporting them all back into to their own home country, and then selling it at higher prices. I mean, to take one example from Britain and India, Britain's entire cotton trade was very artificially developed in that manner, where cotton mills were set up in India. India's traditional clothing trade was disincentivized or destroyed sometimes by creating policies that harmed our domestic trade. And then we were forced to buy all of those products from Britain at a higher price. Sexism and misogyny, and I think you had a session about this already as well, but essentially gender does play a role. Gender discrimination is something that we see around us, we understand as something that has happened historically and continues to happen still. There are many flawed understandings about how women are suitable for certain types of work and not suitable for certain types of work. There are many genders now that are discriminated to the extent of not even being allowed to do a job. They're forced to beg. It is a very recent phenomenon where countries have even, for example, started to recognize the third gender as being an official one. India, thankfully, is one such country. However, whether or not people identifying themselves to be of the third gender have access to the type of jobs that cisgender people have is another matter altogether, because there's a lot of stigmatization, right? To the point where people don't even like looking at people that look different from themselves around them. There are stigmatizations where people will not want that diversity in their office. They will have certain ideas of what the office should look like. We, of course, know that there is a huge gap when it comes to women being in positions of power. There are very bad statistics globally and and in India as well, where we don't have a lot of women CEOs. We see a lot of drain of women from the workforce as soon as we start to get data above a certain level of job, where we see a lot of women in entry level jobs, but we don't see them getting promoted in the same ratio. And these problems exist. There is, of course, the wage pay gap, where there are ideas of what level of salary men deserve and what level of salary other genders deserve, which is based again on gender roles. Because for centuries now, there is this understanding which refuses to go away, that if you're a man, you're responsible for taking care financially of your family, which means that you are the primary earner, and that connects with the kind of power you hold in a salary negotiation. But women and people belonging to other genders are often seen as secondary earners in the family, or seen as people who are doing this job as a hobby or a pastime or something to just, kill time with. And so they lose power in a salary negotiation because their work is not seen as being that important. And that creates that economic inequality between genders. War, of course, in ways similar to which colonialism and racism, like we spoke about, created those inequalities between countries. War has also done that. There have been countries that have invaded other countries and destroyed their trade, their farms, their factories, and it takes decades to build those things up, right? And so if you don't have a strong enough army to protect yourself, which is again a result of how much income, how much wealth existed in your government treasury in the first place, you become more susceptible to having your economic systems destroyed by other powerful countries that may be invading you. We've seen a lot of examples of that in oil rich countries being invaded by Western countries just to capture their oil reserves. And in the course of that, it creating this very disruptive environment where, because of all the strife, because of all the war crimes, it's very difficult to have a stable trade and economic system sustain in such an environment, right? So these are some global factors. Technological progress, of course, we see that around us. The Industrial Revolution is considered a very important moment, actually, where, and this was again from the 1640s till about the 1800s, where around that time we saw, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, we saw many countries get propagated to a very high level of wealth and income, leaving many other countries behind. And that is one moment where people really understood the importance of technology and understood the importance of technological progress, because it impacts your ability to scale up your business, to scale up your industrial operations in a way that people had not imagined before, right? Things like the printing press. I mean, people were writing books by hand, which tells you how many books people were being able to produce in one day. But you suddenly have this automated system where you can produce hundreds of books in a day, which soon scaled up to thousands and so on. So the economic scope of the book business, for example, really shot up. The kind of awareness and education that people suddenly had access to as a result of that shot up, which means that you have many more people who now have access to education that will probably help them set up their own businesses, get better jobs, and so on. So technological progress is another, and different countries are at different levels of tech progress, and that really makes a difference to the kind of income levels that you are at. Natural reserves, like the oil example that I gave, of course, certain countries just have um, scarce natural resources that they may have in abundance, which means that either by using those natural resources themselves or by exporting those natural reserves, they can acquire a lot of money. That is the story of all oil-rich countries in the Middle East right now, right? They may not have other resources, but because they have oil, which is something that literally every other country in the world needs, and it is a resource that is in abundance in their country but scarce everywhere else. It's expensive, and they earn a lot of money through that, and people in those countries afford everything else based on their oil trade. And similarly, such resources are spread out in various ways across the world. Going,
Sonakshi,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt. We've just had a request on YouTube from one of our listeners. If you could just go a little slower. So just wanted
Oh,
to alert you to that.
okay, cool. Thanks. Noted. All right. Thanks for that. So, just going very quickly to country specific factors. Of course, some of the same factors apply in a micro way within the country as well, because, for example, if we take the example of a country like India, we have different types of states, and so some of the same concepts of different states having different natural reserves, or different states have being at a different level of technological progress, those things apply. But it works a little differently because every country has its own social context, right? So for example, a certain country may have been a victim of the slave trade, but in our country, for example, we know that casteism and caste-based discrimination is a very uniquely social problem that we deal with, and it has led to a lot of economic inequality over centuries now. And again, like with racism, this also was propagated because there were certain very uh, emphatic theories that were propagated about how people born into a certain caste only deserve to do XYZ types of work. And in addition to that, XYZ types of work only deserves a certain amount of income. So it's not even like it was just a division of labor, which is how certain people like to characterize it. It had a very important economic implication where uh, propagators of the caste system also decided that certain types of work deserve to be compensated with a lot of income, with a lot of wealth, and people belonging to those castes also deserve to accumulate assets, to have savings. However, people belonging to certain other castes were denied those accesses, were almost prohibited from earning a certain level of income, doing a certain kind of job that can get them higher income, and also prohibited from accumulating savings. I mean, literally, we've had scriptures that tell people that, it is wrong and it is a sin if you are of a certain caste and you are trying to accumulate wealth. And so it's very important for us to always pay attention to what these social systems have said and what these social scriptures have said, because we will find that invariably it will bring us back to the money question, because money and economics has been central to society and to civilization always. So it's very unlikely that religion, for example, will work extremely will work parallelly from money. They will intersect somewhere or the other. And like we realize other things like race and colonialism and sexism, they will all intersect with the money question. Governance and policy, and this takes us back to Smith and Keynes a little bit, because of course uh, different governments and different states have taken different bits of what the economists have suggested over the years, right? And so, for example, one state in India may decide that no, we want to have very specific and deliberate regulations and laws and policies that try to make sure that trade is more fair, that try to make sure that the income is equitably distributed. But certain other states may decide that they don't want to interfere too much in the market, and that will have different implications. And that is one reason among many other reasons why, if you go into the data about the income levels in different states, you will find huge differences. It is also connected to how the government looks at access to certain resources for its citizens. You will immediately see a huge direct connection, where if in any region or in any state, in any country, if all citizens have been provided free access or subsidized access to education, to healthcare, to transport, and the government and government actors have made a deliberate effort to provide these things free of cost or at very little cost, it immediately brings up people's ability to be able to earn better money, right? And these are things that are easy to understand. If I have access to a better education, I can dream of like getting a better degree, and therefore I can dream of and also apply to the kind of jobs that need those degrees, which means I can compete with someone else who has had more generational wealth, for example, which means that that generational gap in wealth that we spoke about earlier, the government or somebody else comes in to create this access so that there is scope for that gap to be filled up. So now I can think of competing with somebody else who naturally had more access, because I have been propped up, I have been supported by something external. So, and then what we spoke about in terms of future, which means that if I am able to access that certain level, maybe my children will not have to be victims of the same generational wealth gap that my parents had to be victims of. So that's how it makes a difference. And financial strength of banks, yeah, again, I mean, connected to basically the assets and resources that a certain region already may have and how they spend it, right? Individual factors, we've spoken about generational wealth and access to resources. This small thing of how, so individual acumen and aptitude also matters, that within the same caste and class or within the same economic context, for example, a certain individual may be more suited or may have more of an acumen to think of ways to access more income or to accumulate more wealth, whereas a certain other person may not have the same acumen, may not have the same ideas. So that's what it means. Market factors and labor market, very briefly, this just means that, so we've been speaking about income, right? And income very directly comes from the kind of work that you're doing, the kind of wages that you're earning on the basis of what skills you have and what job you do. And the labor market simply means the market in which these skills are traded for money, or these jobs are traded for money. And we understand that certain skills at any given moment are more in demand, and therefore they will be given more income, whereas certain skills are less in demand and they will be paid less. I mean, one example of this, for example, can be that a very simple example, engineering, right? Now, I don't know, some of you may have older brothers and sisters, or just in general, there was a time when computer engineering was really booming in India. Like that was the tech boom that we have, which was in the early 2000s, where everybody wanted to study computer engineering because you knew that that's where all the jobs are, that's where all the income is. And so everybody was aspiring to study that. However, at that time and even now, if somebody was to take up the job of an office assistant in a government office, it will not pay the same amount of money. It may not be considered the most prestigious of jobs, and large part of that being that, okay, you're not being compensated in the same way. However, here too, I would just like to conclude this point by saying that this demand and supply of skills and jobs does not work in vacuum. It does not work, it always works in tandem with the social factors we spoke of. For example, um, like I was saying, right, when we spoke about caste, now we know that the job of anyone who cleans the house, who cleans the road, or who sorts the garbage is a very important job. And we also know that it is very much in demand, because literally, if somebody who cleans does not go to their job on one day, that has the capacity to bring the city to a standstill, right? And we've seen that in the past, which means that technically speaking, this skill and this job is very important. It's very highly in demand, which means that in an ideal world, it would pay a lot. Which means that this would really be uh, a job that people would aspire to get, and this would be the type of job that would attract a lot of income. But we see that that's not the case, and we see that being a result of the way in which society is set up and the social systems that we exist in, because there is a lot of stigmatization attached to somebody who picks up the garbage. In our country, that's very attached to caste as well, right? In other countries, it's also related to race. So we see that what should happen in an ideal world, as per the invisible hand of the market, is not happening, because social sectors always have a role to play. Similarly, gender has a role to play. So nurses and teachers, nursing and teaching, these are two jobs where we typically across the world see an abundance of women. Both very important jobs, but there is an interplay between gender and in the way in which these jobs are compensated. Typically, teaching salaries are low, and there have been studies to show that because it has an abundance of women, that has a role to play in how teacher salaries are calculated, right? Okay, so yeah, just to confirm, we're at 3:40. Yeah, and we've gone through about 35 minutes of this, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is just a meme. I'm sure a lot of you come across this on social media, which is just this ongoing debate about how the British Museum has nothing that belongs to them, because Britain was one such very important country that colonized a lot of countries, and among other things, our historical artifacts is what they took back with them. Anyway, brings us to the very important question of why we should care, right? Like, all of this theory and all of this context about how there's various types of economic inequality. Okay, what then? Very simply, and like we spoke about how there is a certain code of ethics and certain principles by which human civilization operates. Unequal quality of life of human beings is something that we shouldn't be okay with, right? It leads to a lot of strife, it leads to a lot of um, unhappiness, conflict, and that's not okay. That's not the kind of civilization that we envision. Leads to a lot of war, it leads to conflict, it leads to crime, a lot of strife. So while war is also a cause for global economic inequality, it's also important to understand that the more this inequality deepens, or the more it continues, it creates hope for more war, for more conflict. Because when you see so much inequality and difference around you, uh, it it leads to desperation, right? It leads to people wanting to take those resources by force, especially if they are feeling like they have been wronged, especially if they are feeling like the access to that income and resources is being kept from them as a result of factors that are beyond their control. So there is a very simplistic understanding often that if you work harder, you will make more money, or if you work more hours, you will make more money. But as we start to understand a few of these underlying factors that affect economic systems, we realize that there are a lot of barriers. I may work 10 hours a day, but because of my social location in society and my geographical location in the world, and because of what my parents did and the kind of government that I have, there is a very big ceiling above me up till which I can ever dream to earn. Like there is only a limit till which I will be able to acquire wealth or acquire incomes unless important action is taken, unless some kind of positive intervention is done to break that ceiling. Some positive intervention is done to account for those inequalities that exist and try and bridge the gap, right? So in its current form, this economic inequality just continues the cycle of conflict and crime and war. The climate crisis, and I mean, I'm sure we're seeing examples of this all around us already. It's a very big and crucial concern across the world, but there are certain countries that are getting affected more than others. Within those countries, there are certain economic classes that are getting affected more than others. If there is a flood, if there is a drought, we discussed this before. If you are already in a vulnerable position, you are more likely to get more deeply impacted by this, and this is only going to continue. And then eventually, basically, this kind of stability is necessary for any economic and political system to sustain and run smoothly, right? Because if you have economic inequality, as a result of that, you will have this conflict and war and crime, which means that your political and economic systems will remain unstable. And therefore, smooth trade or fair trade is that much less likely to continue. So it's a cycle. Bringing us to the last bit of this session, right? What can we do? And what can you guys do? Which all of you are here to answer that question for yourselves and each other. Now, something to start this thought with is that instances of social inequality have a direct impact on economic inequality and vice versa, like we discussed. Which means that the first thing for us to do is to observe the world around us, right? What situations and actions do we observe around us that are directly contributing to inequality? The first step is always to become more aware. And as soon, I mean, in our house, and as well as soon as we step out, or as soon as we go to school, as soon as we go to the playground, these instances, if we observe closely, we will understand how these concepts that we talk about are manifesting themselves practically. In school, for example, are the students in our classroom all feeling included and heard in the class? And if not, it's worth going into why that might be happening, right? Do we see students being discriminated against on the basis of their English language skills, or the kind of shoes they wear, or the kind of bag that they carry? Is this discrimination being done by other students, by seniors, by teachers? These are things to watch out for. In the home, service providers or workers that come to our home regularly, do they have children? Have we spoken to them about that? Do their children go to school? What kind of support might they need in their studies? Because and of course, you may already be aware of this. There was a policy that came out a few years ago that mandated that all private schools have to allow for subsidized education for some students belonging to economically backward classes, which means that a lot of students who may not have earlier gained access to those good schools or those private schools now have access. But is being in the classroom enough? Even despite being in the classroom, they may still be finding it difficult, or you may still be finding it difficult to catch up with what is going on in the class, to catch up with what is being spoken about. And that might be either because the environment is very different. It may be because all of us have access to very different kind of educational support at home, right? My mother may have gone to college and done a master's, and she may be able to help me with my homework, but my friend's mother may not have had the opportunity to have that education, which means that at home my friend may not have that support. Do we see that play out around us? Is someone talking to these children about what kind of career options they can aspire to have? If no, why do you think that is? Oftentimes, the career options that we think we have access to or we can take up are a direct result of what we see our parents doing, of what we see our uncles and aunts doing, of what we see our friends' parents doing. And so, if that's not immediately visible to us, it may feel very unreachable to us. So, what is it that we can do to make sure that uh, students in the classroom or all children in the neighborhood or in the classroom have better access to at least that information, right? So I think these are just some very starting ideas about how we can start to be a little bit more aware about our own surroundings and start to see how economic inequality is playing out, and that I'm sure is going to lead to very good ideas from all of you about what kind of realistic community project can be taken up, which can, in some way aim to bridge this gap. So yeah, thank you very much. This is all from my end. That is my Instagram and my Twitter and my email if any of you want to write to me later. But I think now we can just maybe take some questions. Is that okay, Nidhi?
Yeah, absolutely. We already have a question actually. And the question is, how is economic inequality there if the income depends on the kind of work he or she does? So you've already addressed this a little bit by talking about the ceiling and the social factors, but could you shed some light on maybe how we can recognize something as economic inequality, especially given that, there are so many different kinds of jobs that are difficult to compare with each other. So if you can share some insight on that.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a very fair question that one can't really go into income inequality and compare two different kinds of sectors or two different kind of jobs. So I think the answer very much is in this question, which is that we start small, right? I mean, if we want to get into that data and statistics, we try and look at within the same sector what kind of income differences there are. Like taking from an example I shared earlier, and that is also because that sector is researched on a lot. If we, for example, go into the tech sector in India, there's a lot of statistics about what kind of people are entering the tech sector. There will then be statistics about how many men versus how many women are being employed in the tech sector. Statistics will emerge age wise. So you will be able to see that between the age group of 20 and 30, are different genders being paid differently, or are different communities being paid differently? So that will give you one common parameter. So the common parameter can be age, sector, and then you can see what differences are emerging. So you're very right that some commonality has to be taken, and then within that, if you check for differences or you check for data on differences, that is a good starting point to understand, if that answers your question.
Yeah, that was, that was the main question that people had in terms of, how can you say that there is economic inequality? But
Right.
perhaps,
Okay. Yeah, sorry. I mean, if that's the only, do you want me to like maybe speak for a couple of minutes more on that, if that is the question that has come up?
yeah, or, if you want to share some more, tips, because the last section was also quite useful in the sense of, what are some concrete directions in which students can start thinking. So if you can also share for any students hoping to work on economic inequalities around them, what are the things that you feel like they should keep in mind while designing projects?
Okay. Okay. I think tip number one would definitely be to look at data and to look at statistics. And I don't mean that in a way to intimidate, but I think that always becomes a good way for us to get our basics right. So for example, even when I was preparing for this session, now I mean theoretically there are some of these concepts that I work with or I've studied over the years, but in order to prepare for this, I knew that I had to go back and Google, okay, what is the global inequality percentages? So for example, there is this one piece of data which says that, okay, very quickly. Yeah, that globally top 10% of the population of the world holds 85% of the income of the world, whereas the bottom 90% population of the world has the remaining 15% wealth. Now, this is a very impactful statistic in which that it very quickly tells me that, okay, there is a lot of concentration of wealth in among the top 10 richest people of the world. And so that gives me a very base level data point to then start to think about these things, that, okay, this is a problem. So then I can go into what the problems are. Typically, any article that you look at for this data is also going to delve into the reasons for this, right? But if you start your research with the data point, you will have the main thing, which is the problem, and then you will be able to go into what is the problem. Similarly, yeah, even for India, for example, now there are 2 or 3 types of data that you will get. You will get the average per capita income. That's what is the parameter that we use to look at average income. Per capita income is what it's called. There will be an average, but if you start to read into it, you will also be told that, okay, an average income does not mean that everybody in the country is making the same amount of income. It just means that we added up everyone's income and we divided it by the number of people, and this is the number we got. But again, that might mean that only a very few people are actually making that level of income. But because there's people who are making more than that and people who are making lesser than that, we get that average. So once you have the statistic, typically from the same source, you will also be able to get a couple of points which contextualize that statistic for you a little bit. So that's how you will be able to balance the numbers with the social story behind that number. So I think keeping that balance when you think about these things is always a good idea. In terms of designing the project, of course, like starting small and keeping it realistic is the way to go about it. I think there is no need to get intimidated by these numbers in a way that discourages us. And that's a very real problem that we can have. I have it, people that work with me in the sector have it, because on many days you feel like this problem is too big for any of us to do anything about. But that's not true, because as soon as you start a project or as soon as you do anything, you will do something small, even if it ends up being a conversation with another student that you have, and that's going to lead to some change in thought eventually, and that itself is, I think, very important change. I think that's why, we also do sessions like this, because the idea is to become more aware, and as soon as that awareness happens, somewhere something is changing, because at the very least it will lead to changes in our own actions, right? So maybe when we enter the job market, or when we start to deal more with questions of our own money, we will be a little bit more aware of what our privileges and disadvantages are. And therefore, when we are in hiring positions, for example, or when we are competing for those positions, we will be a little bit more aware of what those factors are. And that's how change starts. So without getting too cheesy, I think that's something to keep in mind. And I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sonakshi. That's super useful. We also just got in another question, which asks, with increasing opportunity to education, our job insecurities and other insecurities are also increasing. So how would you think about it?
Right. So, I mean, as we see again from research that's been conducted over decades, and again, as a result of very deliberate government policy as well, access to education has gone up, like you said, which means that a lot of various types of jobs have become available. However, I also know again from data that unemployment rates are very high, at least in India right now, which again tells us that only one factor, unfortunately, is not enough to always lead to a direct increase in jobs as well. Because now we know that because of many other factors, such as the nature of jobs having become very unstable, a lot of gig jobs having come in as opposed to like stable 9 to 5 jobs with a stable salary having come in, the number of government jobs having gone down. Uh, there is still a lot of insecurity in the job market. However, to the extent that people having access to a lot of jobs, a lot of globalized jobs, a lot of international jobs, as a result of more international trade, more policy that allows for that interchange to happen, that has happened, and that's a good thing. And I think we should uh, be mindful of that positive change as well. Not sure if that answers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This was really, really insightful. And, from everything that you've talked to us about, we kind of really learn how there's so much about the economy that we need to pay attention to, and also the linkages between the social factors and economic factors that we always need to keep in mind, and that the economy doesn't work sort of in a silo, so to speak. So thank you so much for making the time to talk to all of us. I hope that everybody watching has also taken away something to think about, something useful. I'm quite sure that you have. As you know, this was the third of the knowledge sessions, and we'll also be having another one on the 30th of this month on project planning. So if you haven't had a chance to register and make your teams, please do so. This week, this is a great opportunity for you to register and start thinking about what projects you want to ideate on as part of the YLAC Social Action Incubator, so that you can also receive a little bit more guidance on planning and teamwork in the coming week. The last day to register is 7th October, and registration will also give you access to a lot more resources and guidelines on making your project proposals. And the last day to submit your round 1 proposals is 8th October. So thanks so much for joining, and thank you once again, Sonakshi, for being here and talking to us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thanks, Nidhi, for organizing this. Thanks, Ishita. All the best, everyone.
Thank you, Sonakshi.
Bye.
Thank you so much for joining.
Have a great day.
Bye.